Hello, I think it's working. It's been a while since I've had this set up, so I'm just double checking all the equipment, but it all looks good to me. Um, I'm just going to forgive me messing around here. This will all be edited out in the proper one. This is the live for those of you who are eager and in the right time zone, and then I'll do a little bit of an edit on these and then put up the version without all of this waffle. So forgive me as I just hide myself, because it's very awkward whenever I'm seeing myself 2 seconds behind on the screen. So let me get rid of that. Perfect. Let me know if you can hear me before I minimize this. The way this is going to work is I'm going to do a bit of an introduction, and then if you have any questions you want to ask, there's a live chat, and you can just write into the live chat any questions you have, and if there's any questions there at the end, I'll have a look. So as I say, I think it's all working. We have about 20 people on, I think. I hear. Thank you very much, Paula. Appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to take your word for it and then get rid of this. There we go. All right. Is there anything I want to say before we officially kick off? I don't know. We have about 350 people this year, which I think is very good. At least 350 people who I see going through. So we've got a nice bunch. We've got an active WhatsApp group. I think it'll get more active as the weeks progress, but if you're not signed on to that, recommend you do that. But without further ado, we should get officially started. So hello there and welcome to, this is the second week of Atheism for Lent. We started on Wednesday and you've only had 3 reflections so far. And the way that I've set Atheism for Lent up this year, and the same last year as well, is by beginning with the arguments for the existence of God. Now, in reality, there are a lot of arguments. There's over 100 different arguments that can be brought together, but they can generally be put into a few different buckets. And some of those arguments are not very good, right? So, I say there's over 100 arguments, and if you go onto YouTube, you'll find lots of them out there and put into forms. But, there's about 12 or so buckets, and the most important ones, philosophically speaking, are versions of what you did in the first few days. Now, as I say, this is just the foothills. I wanted to start off, if we're going to do this dance of atheism and theism, to begin somewhere in terms of affirmation. And so we looked at the teleological arguments, the cosmological and the ontological. So that's what you've done so far. If you're like me, I don't know why I did this. This year, I completely threw myself into these arguments. So I know those reflections. So I kind of went on and did some others, read a book and did some YouTube deep dives. And I've spent a whole week revisiting the arguments for the existence of God. And it has been very enjoyable and also quite exhausting. So I'm kind of glad that I'll maybe be leaving that behind. But it was a fun week. I'm always amazed in the last decade how much good material is freely available online now for any kind of subject at all. So if there's some argument that you were particularly interested in, there's lots of stuff you can explore. So what I want to do with these seminars is briefly introduce what's coming next. I tend to waffle a lot and talk a lot. That's what I do for a living, but I do want to actually keep these relatively tight, because there's a processing room that happens an hour and a half after the start of this seminar. So this seminar is 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, which means at 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, there is a processing room. And for anybody who's able to do that, I really recommend it. That's a place to really discuss the things in more detail. But what I'm here to do is just give you a little bit of an introduction each week to what you might find. And what we're about to go into, again, this will not be very new to many of you, because some of the arguments that you'll encounter this week are at least loosely connected with what was called New Atheism, that was very big in the early 2000s. And it's kind of a lot of the standard arguments against the existence of God. But I've tried to give a few of the really key ones, the very important ones, to kind of like set up where we go from there. And I didn't do this on purpose, but actually 3 of the reflections are from the 18th century, which was a very important century for the birth of the Enlightenment. This is where there was a lot more freedom to separation from the church, and a belief in autonomy, and a belief in people using the powers of reason. And it was a time of great progress in terms of the sciences, in terms of philosophy being freed from maybe some of its scholastic constraints. So 3 of the reflections are from 18th century thinkers, and the others are, I think, 20th century. So what we have is, to start with, we have Jean Meslier. I wasn't going to put him in, and then last minute I decided to. What I want to do, well, with most of these weeks, but with this week in a particular way, each week has a particular way that I want to kind of open up an interesting conversation. And this week, you'll notice that these critiques are not all from atheists. These are the kind of the atheistic critiques, but it's a bit more complicated than that. I remember when I was young and in university, and I was reading a paper, and I think it was exploring questions of gender, something like that. And the opening line of this article I was reading, and it's the only thing I remember about the article, the opening line was, "I'm a lesbian who likes to have sex with gay men." And I remember reading that line and stopping and going, okay, all of that I have to think about, right? Because it's kind of like it's blurring some boundaries or some lines that I'd never thought about. And so, I say the article I don't think was that good or anything, but that opening line, I do remember it kind of stopping me in my tracks. And what you'll notice in a different way with this week is, you have a priest who is a rabid atheist, who is so critical of religion and critical of the biblical text, right? But is a lifelong priest. We have a theist philosopher who gives one of the most devastating critiques of any of these rational arguments for the existence of God. And then you have an atheist philosopher, David Hume, whose critique of religion, the one we're going to look at this week, is a dialogue between 3 theists. So there's no atheist in the dialogue at all. And so, and also then there's a very famous atheist philosopher, Anthony Flew, who at the end of his life became a theist, a deist. Now, very controversially, he was suffering from very severe cognitive decline. And so there are a lot of questions around whether he was used by a group of evangelicals, and he was not at his best. I have a friend who interviewed him at that time for the BBC, and they never used the interview because he wasn't in a good state. So already you've kind of like the boundaries that we often put in place between atheist and theist, even in this second week that you're going into, which is really one of the standard atheist critiques. You suddenly go, okay, say you've got this atheist priest, you've got this theist, you've got this atheist who's writing from a theistic perspective. It's kind of more interesting. But what holds them all together is a critique of the arguments for the existence of God. Like they all kind of have various critiques about that. And this can help us understand something. There was actually a comment I got on my YouTube channel recently from somebody who said that atheists pretty much agree that the theistic arguments are insufficient. They don't work. And that's true. Most atheists, in fact, it makes kind of sense that atheists would think that these arguments are not sufficient. They're not convincing. But the other side of that is most theists don't find them sufficient or convincing either. So that, as I say, kind of joins everybody together in that there's very few people who think these really work, including many of the people who made the arguments. A lot of the thinkers who put these arguments together saw themselves as doing something within church life. Anselm, for example, his argument for the existence of God was in the form of a prayer. And it was almost like clarifying the nature of God to those people who already believed. So there's a sense in which even the people who put forward these arguments aren't necessarily saying that they think they're sufficient to convince somebody. But we'll, as I say, this week see some of the critiques. And the first person we start with is Jean Meslier, because Meslier is such a fascinating character. He is credited as being really one of the first modern writers to write a systematic account of atheism. And he was doing that in France in the 18th century. But what makes it even more interesting is that this was someone who was a lifelong priest, a parish priest, and a very good parish priest, someone who stood up for his parishioners, who turned away from honours and from money and got in trouble often for standing up for his parishioners. So this was a man of great integrity. And what was discovered after his death was that he was working on a manuscript, a memoir, that was this devastating, angry and frustrated and insightful critique of religion, of the biblical text, and of the idea of God. It's all in there. So this became kind of like a very important text for other thinkers like Voltaire. But what was fascinating, as I say, is that this came from somebody who knew Christianity, knew the religion, knew the biblical text, and had thought all his life about questions concerning God. And that partly draws out this dialectic that I'm going to be coming back to again and again, which is the idea that a position is put forward, a critique is made, a new position arises, but the critique at its best arises from within the position, right? Not from outside it, but really from the people who are deeply within it. And Jean Meslier was deeply within this position. So we start off with him. You're just going to have a little audio listening to his life, a little bit about his life, and then there's a supplemental reading. It's very short, which is a little extract from his work. And then there's also a link to the book. You'll probably be able to find the book for free actually online somewhere. It's called Testament. So he's a very interesting character. Then you will encounter Anthony Flew. Anthony Flew wrote what was and might still be one of the most read philosophy papers in the world. It was translated into dozens of languages, and this is what you're going to be getting, and a little bit of it. It's called Theology and Falsification. And Flew, basically, there were two arguments that he made that have proved very influential. The first was an essay called The Burden of Proof. We actually did that last year. You're not doing it this year, but you can find it online. The Burden of Proof. And in that, Anthony Flew argued that atheism proper is not a positive position. It's a negation. It's a not theist. So the atheist is not so much somebody who's going out onto the street preaching some doctrine or some belief. They have a lack of belief. They believe one less thing than the theist, right? A theist and an atheist might believe in the same number of things, with one exception. The theist has the belief in God, the atheist doesn't. And so Anthony Flew argues that the burden of proof is on the theist. Now Flew is not aggressively anti-theist here. He's actually going, no, theists do put arguments forward. And if you want to be an atheist of integrity, whenever somebody brings an argument to you, you can sit down and you can assess it. But Flew felt for most of his adult life that none of the arguments were sufficient. And that leads us to another of his famous essays, and this is what you'll be getting this week, an essay called Theology and Falsification. And Anthony Flew in that article kind of gives an exposition of what often happens between a theist and an atheist, where the theist puts forward an argument, the atheist then assesses it, finds some problems within it, but then the theist goes away and they make some caveats and some changes, and then they come back with this revised argument, and then it's critiqued. Now, this can sound like the dialectic, the critique, the position, the critique, the position, but what Flew argues is, he says, what often happens is the argument becomes more and more abstract and less falsifiable. And eventually, you're left with an argument that just can't be falsified. There's nothing you can do with it. And this was important because Flew's arguing that if you have a position, if you have a theory, and you can't falsify it, there's no real intellectual value to it. So even in the world of science and physics, there are theories that currently are not falsifiable. I think string theory is one of those where the technology doesn't exist to create empirical studies. But technically, in the future, that could be falsifiable, right? So it may not currently be falsifiable, but in the future, technology might exist that might allow it to be. But Flew's making an even stronger argument here. He's saying that ultimately these arguments become unfalsifiable in principle. Like arguing for, Bertrand Russell said, like a teapot in the center of the universe. It's not anything we can argue about because we're not going to ever be able to verify or falsify that. And of course, technically, we could one day. So even that makes more sense than some of the arguments for the existence of God. Now, this week you'll encounter maybe two examples of this. One with David Hume and the other with a guy called J.L. Mackie. So with David Hume, he's fascinating. He's another 18th century thinker, one of the most important philosophers of his generation, still one of the canonical philosophers. And he wrote a famous book, a dialogue that was basically a dialogue between three friends. This is a philosophical tradition where Plato used to do it and others, where you would explore philosophy by creating characters and almost like having a play where they're all talking. And so Hume wrote this book of three friends talking. One of them was Cleanthes, Dema, and Philo. And Cleanthes, if I'm saying his name right, was basically a philosopher who believed in the arguments. So from week one, he was representative of what's called a natural theologian, a very dominant position at the time of the 18th century. And then Dema was someone who's more of a mystic, believed in God, but was skeptical that the arguments could tell us anything about the nature of God. And then you have Philo. And Philo also believes in God, but he finds that the argument, and they're talking about the argument from design in the excerpt that you're going to have, thinks that if you take this argument seriously, you get a weak God, right? God exists, but God's a bit rubbish, right? Now, when Hume wrote this, it was seen as so controversial that he was encouraged by his friends not to publish it. And so it was published posthumously. And you go, why would it have been such a controversial book? Because it was three theists, not an atheist, but three theists. But when you think about it, you go, well, actually, that's pretty controversial. It would actually be less controversial maybe if it was an atheist who was critiquing some argument. But this is a theist who's going, I believe in God. And I think, we can look at the universe and we can maybe say something about God. And what we can say is God's a bit rubbish. And that is one of the critiques that can be made, is that if the universe is designed, doesn't seem to be a great design, right? There's a lot of things that seem to go wrong. And Hume is playfully exploring that, so you'll get that reflection. But a better example is from Mackey. And what we have in that day is the argument from evil. This is one of the most famous arguments that's put forward to say that God as an idea is inconsistent with the reality of our experience. And the argument goes that there are three statements which cannot coexist. And these three statements are: God is omnibenevolent, right? Wholly good, omnibenevolent. God is omnipotent, right? God is all-powerful. And there is evil. Right? So these three statements can't exist together. You can have two of them, right? You can have a God who's omnipotent, and you can have a world where there is evil, because you can say that, well, God's all-powerful, but maybe God doesn't care, right? Or you could say that, oh, God is omnibenevolent, and there is evil, because then you can say, well, God would like to make sure that there was no evil, but does not have the power to do it. Or you could say God is omnipotent and God is omnibenevolent and there is no evil in the world. But that seems to contradict our very basic experience of reality. So this argument that goes way back to the Greeks is the idea that if you want an all-powerful, all-good God, that does not cohere with the reality of unnecessary suffering, of evil in the world. Now, what's interesting about what Mackey does with this argument is Mackey basically says what we all know, which is, well, no theist really says that, right? You have to put caveats in, right? You don't just say those three things. You might say, well, God limits God's omnipotence by allowing free will. So you put that caveat in. But then you might go, yeah, but what about cancers and, the other destructive things that we see in the world that aren't to do with human free will? And then you might put a caveat in saying, well, that's spiritual beings, or that are doing those evils. Or you might try to say, well, evil is an illusion. What looks like evil to us is just because we have such a myopic perspective. It's like a stain that we're looking at on a painting. If we're so close to the painting, it's just a stain, but if we pull back, we realize it's not a stain, it's part of a greater tapestry. Right? So there's people who might try to argue that, and there's various ways to try to put caveats onto this problem. But going back to Anthony Flew, he would say that, well, you go back and forth, and eventually, yes, you might get an argument with so many caveats that you can't falsify it. But also then it becomes so useless. It doesn't really tell you anything. It's of no value. It's not falsifiable. It's not verifiable. So it's of no real value. And as I say, that's what you'll be seeing with Flew in this very, very good parable that you'll encounter. Then connected in a complementary way, but going a slightly different direction, you'll encounter Immanuel Kant, who argues that pure reason cannot get us to ultimate reality. So Immanuel Kant was, and is one of the most important philosophers who ever lived. And he's very famous for showing that what we experience of the world is not what the world is in itself. We experience the world through filters, and he explored what those filters were. He explored the scope and limitations of our understanding. But he ultimately said that pure reason gets us tied up in knots, and he called these knots antinomies. And he said, so pure reason can get you to believe that God exists, and it can get you to believe that God doesn't exist. Pure reason can get you to the place where you think that the universe is eternal, or that it had a beginning. Also, he said, pure reason can get you to the point where you can reason that the universe is infinitely divisible. Right? You can just cut it. And also that there must be some indivisible kind of basic structure of reality. So what he does with these various antinomies is he says, pure reason gets us to both. And he very famously, and I think very effectively, argued. Now, this is not knocked down in their responses, but I think he very persuasively gave an argument to say that the teleological argument, if it works, it has to rest on the cosmological argument. So, for example, if we look at the world and we say we think it's ordered, all that tells us is that there was a greater intelligence that's ordered our world. But then there might be a greater intelligence beyond that intelligence, and then one beyond that. So today people talk about sometimes, we could be living in a simulation. So some hyper-intelligent civilization has created all of this. But that's just another level up. What Kant would say is that to avoid this infinite regress, you have to move from an intelligent designer to an intelligent designer that necessarily exists, right? And as soon as you go from intelligent designer to that necessarily exists, you're in the cosmological argument. And then he argues that for the cosmological argument to work, it ultimately rests on the ontological argument. So he argues that, yes, in the cosmological argument, you might argue there's something that necessarily exists, but, there's an argument that that's mathematics or quantum fields or certain very basic structures of reality. But if you want to say that it's God, then you need to rest on this idea of that you saw with Descartes, that God's existence and essence are one. God is the only thing in which the definition includes existence. And so Kant, I think, very interesting, very persuasively shows that the teleological rests on the cosmological, rests on the ontological, and then Kant says, and the ontological, which is about pure reason, doesn't get us to God. It seems to get you to God, but it can also get you to the opposite. And I then throw in one reflection that's a little bit of an example of this, which is an ontological argument that proves that God does not exist, by a contemporary philosopher called Gaskin, who actually just wrote this on a napkin in a coffee shop. And so it's kind of playful, but it's a way of showing kind of how pure reason can also get you to the opposite of the existence of God. So all of that to say, this week, and it's a nice mix of audio and little things to read, and most of it's pretty short, but you will encounter, as I say, a priest who offers one of the first systematic critiques of atheism. You'll encounter this notion of theism, like rational arguments, ultimately always being changed and moved around until they become so slippery and so unfalsifiable that they become useless. And then also you will encounter this idea that pure reason doesn't get us to be able to definitively answer these questions rationally one way or the other. So if the first few days was the affirmation of the existence of God through reason, then this week you'll start to encounter people who critique that, and that will set us up then for the week after. So I don't know if you have any questions at this point. I'm just going to check in the live feed and see if there's anything there. Oh yes, Jade, let's see. Jade asks, would you include Meslier as an example of someone, to quote, seeing the nothing behind the temple curtain, like Mother Teresa and Bonhoeffer? That's a great question. So, and also showing that you know where we're going here a little bit. The difference between, because you mentioned Mother Teresa and Bonhoeffer, is they have a much more complex and interesting relationship with Christianity and faith. And that will kind of become clear in future weeks. Like Meslier is fascinating. I find he's an interesting guy, but he does, in Testament, he does talk about the early church giving to the poor, and he does see in some of the early church, the very early writings in the Gospels, compassion and care for the poor and the needy. But mostly he is just very critical of religion in its entirety and the Bible and God. So yeah, I think it's definitely different from Bonhoeffer and Mother Teresa. But actually, the idea of seeing behind the curtain is a good analogy in the sense that he is in the heart of he was in the heart of the whole religious tradition and was a person of his time. This is the 18th century. This is the optimism of reason. This is the kind of the advance of the sciences. So he's kind of a man of his time. He kind of was born at a very moment, like he went into the church because his parents wanted him to do it, and he ended up there, and then he got so annoyed that everyone around him, it seemed just about wealth and prestige. But he kind of was like pushed into the church at the same time as the academy was bursting forth with all of these philosophers and scientists. So I guess in a way, kind of would like to have been in that team, but he ended up in this team, stayed there all his life, and critiqued it from within. Paula says, this year I'm reading Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a young man, just sharing what can we do along with these reflections personally. Oh yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, Joyce's Portrait of an Artist as a young man, very good. Good old Irish text. I wonder, how that fits with it. I actually have never read it. I've read a little bit of Joyce and have found him very, very difficult. So I haven't done much. All right, I'm going to leave you there. Thank you for doing this. Join the processing room if you can. I hope you enjoy this week's reflections.